Okay, so today, continuing on with Aristotle, we're in Nicomachean Ethics. Book 2, last class, what did we talk about? We talked about the nature of happiness and what the good life is. And we had this term that came up over and over again, virtue, right? And a lot of other things came up as candidates for happiness, and those aren't awful things, you know. Pursuing wealth, does that make you a bad person? No, you actually need some wealth. You need some property. From Aristotle's perspective, you're actually going to have a hard time being a good person if you're dirt poor. You'll have a harder time, too, if you're very rich, because you'll be subject to more temptations. But you actually need to have some means. What about pleasure? Should your life be a life devoted to duty and, depriving yourself of pleasures so that you can, concentrate just on that? No. A good life is a pleasant life. And we can talk about different kinds of pleasures. We'll do that more when we look at Book 7. There's some pleasures that probably we shouldn't indulge in, like, heroin. Heroin's very pleasurable, but, you get yourself into that one, and pretty much everything else is going to take a back seat. But there's a lot of pleasures that are really worthwhile, and some that Aristotle would want you to cultivate. The pleasure of that comes with doing good actions. He wants that for you. That's a good thing. Health. Health is an important condition too, right? Even honor or respect, those are important things. Relationships are important. But ultimately for Aristotle, what's going to determine this question of what makes something good or bad is going to be virtue and vice. So that's what we're going to look at today, the nature of virtue and vice. Before that, I want you to do a little bit of preparatory work. So almost all of you have note paper out. I'd like you to write down some answers to these questions. I'd like you to think about one thing that you're good at. Everybody here is good at something. And, it could be something as trivial as you're really good at arranging things on a desk. People look at your desk and they say, wow, that's a very tidy, orderly desk. I'm betting that all of you are good at something way beyond that, something more important in scope. For some of you it might be something musical or artistic. Some of you it may be something more intellectual. For some of you it may be something physical. Or tied in with your emotions. But I want you to think of one thing that you're good at. And then I want you to think a bit, and you probably will have to think about this. How did you actually get good at it? I mean, you may have had some native talent. Probably you did. Because we like to do things that we're already a little bit good at, right? And then we tend, if we're not good at it, then we say, I'm going to leave that for some other time. But that's not all that went into it. So think about how you actually got good at it. If you're still good at it, how do you actually maintain your level of skill or expertise or goodness? And then I want you to think about this. Let's say you actually did have some, talent and you cultivated it. How would you take somebody else who doesn't have talent and make them good at it? So I want you to, I'm going to bring this up a little bit later. As we're going through this stuff, I want you to think about these things, and then I'm going to ask you about them, and we're going to use them as examples in class. So back to Nicomachean Ethics Book 2. You notice I put this kind of schema up on the board. And a big question, what makes actions? What makes an action? That's one of the things we talk about in ethics. Something you do or don't do. But also, for Aristotle, an emotional response. Aristotle thinks that you can be too angry, or not angry enough, or that your desires can be too strong or too weak, or that you can feel joy or sadness or pain or pleasure for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons. We can evaluate our emotions. This is something that's really foreign to a lot of people. In our culture, we're often told, we often distinguish between our actions and our emotions. And we always tell people, yeah, it's okay to how you feel, you know, just don't act on it. If you act on it, then we'll judge you, but we don't judge your feelings. Well, in virtue ethics, you actually do judge people's feelings. Because, you know, it is possible to go wrong with the way that you feel. Not all feelings are actually well-founded or good responses. Some feelings are, in fact, harmful or unhealthy or ugly or damaging to people. If you're angry, this is why he talks about the virtue of good temper. If you find yourself all the time going off the hook, you know, over little things, there's something wrong. If you find yourself getting angry and then not being able to let it go and having to do something to the other person before you can feel okay, there's a problem there. And you can say, well, that's just my feelings. Well, your feelings can be good or bad. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the actual discussions of the virtues in books 3 and 4 and 5, which is going to come next week. And then there's patterns of behavior, right? We not only feel, the term that your book, or that your text uses is passion, right? We have actions and passions. Passions means feelings, means emotions, means desires, emotional responses. But you have patterns, larger patterns of behavior. Would you trust your money to just anybody? Are there some people that you know that you should not trust with money? Yes or no? Probably every one of you knows somebody you shouldn't trust with money, right? It could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a former friend because you trusted them with money. But is it just their action, single action, that determines whether they're trustworthy or not? I mean, there could be something that somebody does that totally destroys your trust, right? Like for instance, they not only don't pay you back, they use that money to steal your boyfriend or girlfriend from you, taking them out on a date. That's pretty bad. That would probably cap it, right? If you stayed friends with somebody like that, you're either a saint or you're kind of a sucker, I think. But it's more often patterns of behavior. You know the way a person is by how they act over time. So it's not just, the person lets you down once, or they don't pay you back once. It's that they do this consistently, right? How do you know? That's a matter of justice, paying things back, right? How do you know who would have your back in a fight? Do you know that just by talking with somebody a little bit? No. That's a virtue. That's courage. Could also be a vice. They could be the kind of person who gets in fights all the time and would actually pull you into a fight. That's not a virtue. That's a vice. That's foolhardiness or rashness. But how do you know somebody is going to actually back you up when things get tough? Doesn't necessarily have to be a fight. It could be a meeting where they have to stand up to somebody who's kind of scary. Could be you have a problem with a professor, and you have to go in and talk with that professor who's screwing you around, and your friend is going to come along with you. Some of your friends might sell you out when they get there, right? Or they might turn around and walk out. You don't want that friend, do you? Now, how do you know that that person is going to act that way? Do you know that from just one circumstance? No, you know that from patterns of behavior. We're creatures of habit. The way that we are, our characters, are largely not just single actions or emotions. They're patterns that we have. So how do we actually tell what's good and what's bad in this? So look at all these different things. We have the consequences, right? We have the desires or the intention. You can look basic kind of action or emotional response, just sheer getting angry, you know. You can look at the reasoning that's involved, why somebody's doing what they're doing. That's sort of like intention to a certain extent. And you can look at the person who's doing the action themselves. Now, everybody has to vote. How many of you in here think that what matters the most is the consequences to determine whether something is good or bad? The consequences are important, right? Nobody in here thinks that the consequences are the most important thing? You've all become Aristotelians already. There are some moral theories that think that consequences are the most important thing. We're going to study them. You know, think about Thrasymachus. What was the consequence for him? Having power. Anything that would get you power, that was a good thing. But you don't have to be kind of a bad guy to see that. You could say, you know, anything that promotes human welfare, that's a good thing. If your action promotes it, it's good. If it doesn't promote it, or if it damages it, it's bad. What about your desires or your intention? What you were trying to do, what you were aiming at? Who thinks that that's the most important? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. You guys are probably going to be more attracted to Kant. Although you're going to find a lot in Aristotle when we look at him. And your desires or your intention are very important. You know, one can do an action that has good consequences and do it for the, you know, totally wrong reason. I might teach you Aristotle well, not because I care about your development as students, which would be a good intention, but because I want to get good student ratings, which is probably a fairly neutral intention. But it's not really the best reason why I should be teaching this, right? I could, let's take one that has a little less morally neutral. I could tell somebody at a bar that they are beautiful in order to raise their self-esteem on a day when everybody has been beating them down. It's a good intention, right? Same consequence, they feel better about themselves. Or I might do it just to get them in bed. Let's make it even worse, you know. So I can get them in bed and blackmail them, take incriminating photographs, you know. That's a very different intention, isn't it? So those of you that think intention matters, you're onto something. Who thinks it's the basic type of the action? You can look at certain actions and say, this kind of action is good, this kind of action is bad. Nobody? Remember, everybody has to vote. This is part of class participation for you. Right? What about the reasoning? The thinking out why, you know, how things go. Okay, again, you guys will probably find Kant to be somebody that you can relate to. Also, to a certain extent, John Stuart Mill, but also Aristotle. What about the person? The person doing the action. Who thinks that that is the most important thing? Nobody in here? I mean, this could be understood a couple different ways. Like maybe there's some things that we let people get away with because of who they are, like because they're rich. So, well, that's okay for them, but it's not okay for me. Or, you know, here's something that gets thrown around quite a bit. Years ago, there used to be a lot more debate in philosophy classes and in you know, campuses about abortion. Now people are, you know, sort of in camps and for the most part pretty firmly decided I'm on this side, I'm on this side. There used to be a lot more public discourse about it. And one of the things you'd hear sometimes as a man was, you can't say anything about it because you can't possibly have an abortion. So that's saying it would be bad, it would be wrong for you to say anything about it based on who you are. It would be right for a woman to talk about it, it would be wrong for a man to talk about it. one of the very early legal codes. You guys all remember back in Western Civ, the Code of Hammurabi, beginning of legal codes and all that. It actually had different penalties for crimes depending on who you did the crime to. So if you did the crime to a slave, not so much of a penalty. If you did the crime to a free person, higher penalty. If you did it to a noble person, higher penalty yet. And if I remember right, it also had different penalties depending on who you were. Higher penalties if you were noble, because you were expected to actually be a good person. It's kind of a trick question. All of these matter. Right? All of these are going to be important for ethical decision making. All these are things you have to care about. Things you have to look at in a situation. When you're evaluating, what we're talking about here is evaluation of actions, patterns of behavior, emotional responses. But, and this is where Aristotle is kind of unusual. This here is really important. If you were a Kantian, a deontologist, all that would matter would be the intention. If you were, and we're going to look at this theory later on in the semester, a utilitarian, so if you're Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill or the contemporary philosopher Peter Singer, then all that would matter would be the consequences. And the only consequences you would care about are pain and pleasure to beings that feel pain and pleasure. Who's doing the action, the kind of character that person has, isn't really that important. The intentions aren't that important. What's important is the effects, right? And so there are a lot of different ways of evaluating these things. You have to be able to do that by the time you get to the end of the semester, to be able to say, if I were looking at this like a utilitarian would, here's how I would judge it. If I were looking at this, I would judge it this way. Today we're going to be looking at how you judge character. The first thing that Aristotle actually talks about in this book is how do we develop character? How do we develop good or bad character? And if you think about yourself at this point in time in your life, all of you are good in some respects and bad in other respects, most likely. I mean, there could be somebody among you who's completely well integrated, they've got everything totally lined up, they've cultivated all the virtues, they have no vices, but in my experience that's extremely rare. I can tell you I'm not that person myself. I have some virtuous dispositions with respect to some things, like say courage. I also have some vicious dispositions with respect to other things, like anger. I have a virtuous disposition with respect to what's called liberality, the giving and taking of wealth. I have sort of an in-between disposition when it comes to justice. I do the right thing, but I don't always do it because I love the right thing for its own sake. I do it because I don't want to get punished, or because I worry about what people think. That's not yet a virtuous disposition. When it comes to temperance, I would say that I actually have more of a vicious disposition than I do a virtuous disposition. I eat more than I should. I used to drink more than I should. So I've curbed, some parts of that. So my own character is in some ways virtuous and in some ways vicious. I've got some things worked out fairly well, and at the time that I was at your age, I didn't have most of those worked out. I've always been courageous, maybe even a little foolhardy, but certainly didn't have the anger, at least as much under control as I do now. I've never been temperate in my life. I can actually say I've not always been as close to being just as I am. And I've been prodigal rather than liberal in my spending. I actually made some bad decisions at different points that set me behind. So, if I'm in that case, I wouldn't expect any of you at your age and your level of thinking about this sort of stuff to have all the virtues down. So some of this is an opportunity to think about your own habits, your own virtues or vices, or where you fit in between. How do we become virtuous or vicious? Some people think that it's through knowledge, right? And there is something to this, right? Because how does practical reasoning work? We have things like, you're in a situation, you say, in this situation, X is the right thing. And then you say, okay, I'm in this situation. I should do this, right? So, a friend tells you, I'm going out of town, I want you to watch over my boyfriend or girlfriend, take them out, make sure they have a good time, don't let them, flirt too much with anybody else, etc., etc. What's the right thing to do in a situation like that? Sleep with them? That's a wrong thing, right? I mean, you could do this too. You might be tempted to say, in this situation, I should not sleep with the boyfriend, girlfriend of my best friend. I'm feeling that temptation. I should resist that temptation. Is knowledge always effective like that? Can you make people better simply by saying, well, here's the rules, now follow them? Yeah.
Well, in some instances, a repetitive action isn't like X isn't always good if it's repetitive. Like if you say, okay, all right, in this situation, I should give my friend money because he needs it.
Yeah.
At first could be a good thing, but after a while, it could lead to a bad thing because the person is just
sponging off of it
and not gaining his self responsibility through me just saying no, deal with it yourself.
Yeah, and what you're talking about there is somewhat of a higher order means of practical reasoning. You've got the individual action itself, right? Should I give money at this time to this person? And then you've got the larger, the bigger picture, higher order thing. Is this a good pattern of relationship, of behavior to be in with this person? And you'd have to, that requires thinking out. The point that I'm trying to get across to you is knowledge by itself is not always effective. There's, if you're an ethics teacher, one way that you can make money is by going into businesses and doing kind of a song and dance about, what it is to be ethical. Because businesses want to show the public that they can be ethical, because there's, huge distrust, particularly with corporations. Sort of faith in business has been shaken over the last 2 decades. And one of the ways you can deal with that is you bring somebody in to talk about ethics, right? And then you say, okay, we solved it. Everybody knows what's right and wrong now, and they're going to behave good. They're going to do the right thing. Does that actually work? Not usually, because something else has to be involved. So it's not just knowledge. You are using principles, Aristotle says, but it's heaven. Now here's where, let's look at this question that I asked you. What are you good at? So I'm just going to pick people at random. What are you good at?
I put writing or editing.
Writing or editing? Okay, that's a good skill. What are you good at? Swimming. Okay, that's interesting. And what are you good at?
Multitasking.
Multitasking, which is like a higher order thing that you do with other things. What are you good at?
Parking.
What is it?
Parking.
Parking. Yeah, I am not good at parking, so I actually can admire that. I have a hard time parallel parking, and now that I've moved to New York, and I'm not in this fairly spacious Midwest, sometimes I'll actually get out of the car and have my fiance park the car. I'm almost ashamed to admit. What are you good at?
Film analysis.
Film analysis. Okay. What about you?
Illustrating.
Illustrating. Okay. What are you good at? Either one of you.
Cooking.
Cooking. Okay, that's an important skill. Yeah.
Organizing.
Organizing. Okay. These are all pretty good things to have. Now, for all these things that you guys have raised, and those of you who didn't say what you're good at, did you just start out automatically being good at that sort of thing? How many of you had some talent at what you're good at? Like, I'll say for my part, music, because I can generally pick up an instrument and figure out how it works, and then start monkeying around with it pretty soon, making some sounds. How many of you had to really work at what you're good at, the thing that you're good at now? Okay. Yeah, swimming you would have to. Multitasking. How did you get good at multitasking?
Just having too much stuff to do.
So you were in situations where you had to do it. And I imagine swimming was not quite like that. They didn't just throw you in and say, get good at this. How did you get good at it?
Practice.
Practicing. What about with cooking? How did you get good at cooking?
I understand. So I had to cook myself growing up a lot.
Okay, that's how I got. I got good at cooking in two ways. One was after my dad died, my mom had to go to work, and so then if you wanted to eat, you could either eat what was already heated up or make something yourself. And then when I got to college, you can either pay money to other people to make you good food, or you can learn how to make it yourself. What else? Film analysis. How did you get good at film analysis?
You learn as you watch more movies and through experience. When you're younger, I think you watch movies purely for entertainment purposes. But
Yeah.
when you watch more, you kind of learn that there are movies more for making money and entertainment, and movies for more for like art purposes.
Okay. What else? So we've got practice. We have being thrown in situations. We have observation. Practice again. What else? What are other ways that people got good? How did you get good at parking? Is that just practice, or?
I guess I just have like a natural ability to
Oh, to analyze
spatial
spaces.
awareness.
Yes. Yeah.
And then practice.
It's kind of funny because I have that when it comes to driving itself. Like I can avoid accidents. I have that when it comes to figuring out what can go in a room. When it comes to putting a car in between other cars, no good. Yeah.
With writing and editing, people critiquing my writing and fixing my mistakes, and then I learn from those mistakes.
Actually, writing and editing, that's a good example. You have a couple different things. People critiquing your writing. You got good at writing also through what? Through practice. That's one of the reasons why we make you, or at least your other professors ought to be doing this, make you write a lot, because the only way you will become a good writer is by writing a lot. And writing a lot of different kinds of assignments. Reading other people's writing is very important too. You can't be a good writer without reading a lot of other people. Yeah, just like you can't make good films without watching other people's films. I don't know about parking, but now swimming and other athletic things is kind of interesting too. Do you swim as an athlete, or is it just something for fun?
Fun.
Those of you who are athletes in here, you guys, I think in your fields, you watch films of other athletes, right? I know football people do it. You guys do it in soccer too? And you do it in basketball. Why are you doing that? What are you getting out of that? I mean, it could be just kind of you like watching sports, but that's not what your coach, your coach is probably going to tell you, pay attention to this. Why? Yeah.
It's to kind of learn from the other person's experience of what they're doing right.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go through a big learning curve of making all the wrong mistakes.
Yeah. Is it always though what they do right? Did your coaches ever point out, don't do this? They do? Yeah. What were you going to say, Mr. Perkins?
And so you can also analyze other teams' strategies, so next time
So you
you
can-
play them, you can find flaws.
Yeah, so you can respond to them. The Patriots got themselves in some trouble with that a doing it in some sort of way that they weren't supposed to do it. I still don't quite understand what they were doing that was wrong. But, okay, so these are, now think about how you would coach another person. Because, and this is a good thing to think about, because all of you are going to become practitioners. You're all in a major now. You're all going to become practitioners of a particular skill or art. And probably in your life, you're going to become practitioners in many different arts. You know, you're not just going to be a business person or a psychologist or something like that. You're also going to be a parent. You're going to be somebody involved in your community. You're going to be helping other people to figure out how to cultivate their talents, or if they don't have talent, how to still learn how to do something. So if you can't rely on them having talent, what would you do if you want somebody to learn how to swim? What do you...
Practice.
Practice, right. What if you want to teach them how to cook? If you wanted to pass on what you've got to your kids, what are you going to do?
Maybe like have them like cook with me or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, notice what's going on here. You have habit building. And how do you build habits? By actually doing things in situations. Are they going to learn how to cook while they're swimming? Probably not. Are they going to learn how to swim while they're parking? Probably not. Multitasking could be a little bit different. You might be combining all these different things at the same time, right? Aristotle says, how do we actually become just? By doing just things in situations that require justice. Not necessarily doing just things, while you're just watching TV, but doing just things when you're put into the situation. How do you become brave? Well, by actually being in situations where it's tough and you do have a feeling of fear, and learning how to deal with your fears. Swimming involves some of that, doesn't it? Because one of our natural fears that our body has, this is why waterboarding actually is pretty effective, is drowning. Most animals fear that. And we're no exception. And there are times like when you're going to swim long ways underwater. At one point you had to conquer the fear of being underwater. You had to exercise the virtue of courage, at least within that realm. How else do we do? Also, this goes to Mr. Sadler, right? Mr. Sadler's thing about if he had his kids. We learn through models. We learn through looking at other people who have good qualities, or we learn by looking at people who have bad qualities. We imitate people. And that's the kind of creature that we are. We are very imitative. So if you constantly surround yourself with people who are unjust, you're probably going to turn out to be unjust. It doesn't mean that there's a 100% likelihood that you're absolutely determined, but there's a good chance that you're on that trajectory. So, like he says, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts. To be temperate means to have your pursuit of bodily pleasures under control. So you become temperate by actually not having dessert, when you'd like to, but know that you're counting your calories. Those of you that are in athletics, some of you mentioned being you're in the season, you're in a dry season, you're not allowed to drink. That requires temperance, right? That's developing it. It works the same way for virtues and vices as it does for skills that you have, because virtues and vices are very much like skills. Now he says, what are virtue and vice about? So we've gotten that far. What are these things actually about? And he talks about a few things. He talks about pain and pleasure. How can you tell that somebody really has a virtue? Like that somebody really is a just person? That they are fair, that they don't take more than their fair share because of their character, and not just because you're rewarding them or threatening them or things like that. They feel pleasure in doing it. How can you tell if somebody's really brave? they feel a certain pleasure in standing up against whatever fears, whatever scary things they do. How can you tell somebody's actually temperate? They actually feel pleasure in turning down certain pleasures that go too far. Now, that's why I can say, for instance, I'm not actually just, because sometimes I feel pleasure in doing the right thing, and sometimes I actually feel pain in doing the right thing, and I'd rather do the wrong thing. Some of you may be able to relate, right? That means that I'm not yet virtuous with respect to justice. If you're vicious, you take pleasure in the wrong things. So, think about anger, for example. I'm not going to ask who's got anger problems in here, but I'm willing to bet that at least 1/3 of the class does, given average American culture. Meaning that you get too angry at the wrong times with the wrong people. You hold on to your anger too long. You don't manage it very well. There's a certain pleasure that's involved in vicious anger. That's why we hold on to it, because we get something out of it. It's painful, but it's also pleasurable at the same time. So virtues and vices, we can look at whether somebody actually feels pleasure in what they're doing and say that person is virtuous or not. What else? Virtue and vice are concerned with things that we choose and things that we avoid. So they're concerned with the whole spectrum of what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. He also says what's pleasant, what's not pleasant, what's useful, what's to our advantage, what's to our disadvantage. And then he talks about the noble. And this is something that I want to hit on a little bit, because that term's going to come up over and over again throughout Aristotle. We don't use that term very often, right? Do we talk about anybody being a noble person? I mean, what do you think of when you hear that term? Maybe the British monarchy or something like that? He doesn't mean that. He's contrasting, the word that he's using in Greek could mean beautiful or excellent in some sense, or noble, or we also translate it with fine, and we oppose it to, or the honorable, and we transpose it to the dishonorable, the base, the ugly, all those sorts of things. So it's not just about good and bad in right and wrong sense. It's also about the way people seem to us. You all know some people that you can't stand being around because of the way they behave. You just don't like them, period, right? They kind of disgust you. That would be the opposite of what he's calling noble. You also have some people that you like to be around, and you may not be able to put your finger on exactly why, but you admire them, you look up to them. I hope all of you have somebody like that, right? You do? Yeah. That's noble. That's what he's talking about. So, virtue and vice are concerned with this. Those who are virtuous get these things right. Those who are vicious get these things wrong. Another characteristic that you can look at to see whether something is a virtue or a vice is, does it actually put the human being into a good condition to, be happy? People who are, let's take justice and injustice again. People who are just, remember back to, Book 2 of the Republic? Or book 1 of the Republic too, Thrasymachus. Will the just person try to take advantage of the other just person? No, right? Because they're just. So they can live together well. They're not going to screw with each other. They're not going to steal from each other. They're not going to betray each other. What about unjust people? You guys, probably some of you have lived in the dorms, right? What is it? Are all the people in the dorms just that you live with? In the dorms, it tends to be stuff, confined to stealing and playing music too loud. If you're playing your music too loud every night because you like listening to your music and everybody else should listen to your music, you're unjust. You're being unfair to people, right? So I think you guys have experienced that. You've experienced other types of injustice. Can unjust people live together well? They don't get along with each other usually, and they don't get along with people who are just. they tend to tick people off who are just. They're like, you know, I don't play my music too loud. What the hell's wrong with you? I don't come in at 3 o'clock in the morning and kick doors and wake you up. What the hell are you doing that for? Right? That's a just person, or somebody at least not unjust, telling an unjust person what to do in a very, you know, easy to understand kind of situation. The virtues make us able to fulfill our ends, to live together well. So becoming virtuous is important for that reason. So then what is virtue? What is vice? And here's where Aristotle what he's doing is going way beyond Plato. Plato talked about virtue and vice, right? You guys wrote about it in your third writing assignment. Some of you, said, I've got this virtue to this extent, I don't have this virtue, I need to work on this. Aristotle is going to give you much more of a detailed map of what virtues are. So let's start with what virtues actually aren't, but have to deal with. Are virtues emotions by themselves, like anger or fear? No. Virtues have to do with some sort of subject matter. And these can be actions. These can be emotions. These can be other goods that we have, like wealth. Virtues have to do with something. So courage is not the same thing as temperance. It's not the same thing as liberality. But they all have the same basic structure. One of the insights that Aristotle had, and this is, if there's only one thing that you remember from this semester with respect to Aristotle, 10 years down the line, when I run across you, run into you at the grocery store, the train station, or some other place, this is the one thing I would really like you to remember. Virtue is what we call a mean, or another way of understanding mean is the middle thing between excess and deficiency. It's sort of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? You guys all remember that story. What did Goldilocks always settle on? What's that? What was moderate? And she put it in terms of just right. This porch is too hot, this porch is too cold, this is just right. This bed's too lumpy, this bed's too soft, this one's just right. What else did she have? Bed, chairs, she broke one chair, I think. Porridge, I don't remember what else she had. But you get the idea. Virtue is just right. So it's going to be relative to a certain extent, right? What counts as a temperate meal for me is going to be a little bit bigger. Shouldn't be massively bigger, but a little bit bigger than for somebody who's smaller. And most of you are smaller. I think all of you are smaller than me in this class. Maybe at least by weight. What counts as courage is going to depend on the situation, isn't it? I mean, there could be some responses that are the right amount in this situation, but are too much in this situation. So it's going to require evaluating what's just right. Excess is what? Too much. And deficiency is too little. And with any of the virtues and vices that we're going to look at over the next couple weeks, you can have too much of something, too little, or just right. If we take courage, for example, courage actually has to do with actions, but it has to do with two kinds of feelings. One is fear. You all know that, because if I ask you what courage is, you're probably going to say something like standing up to your fears. It also has to do with the feeling of confidence, which is the opposite, and that can be mixed in with fear. And courage is when you actually have the right amount of fear. It doesn't mean having no fear, because, you know, scary things, if they really are scary things, you ought to be scared of them. If you're not, then you're on the wrong side. You're nuts. You're crazy. And there are some people like that, and those are sometimes good people to have, like, you know, in a fight or in war, but oftentimes not. Oftentimes they get you in trouble. They break ranks. They you know, start opening fire too early, and they screw the whole thing up for everybody. That's recklessness, or rashness, or foolhardiness. A lot of our heroes that we see in movies are actually not courageous. They're reckless. If they don't feel any fear whatsoever, there's something wrong with them. Something is switched off inside the brain of the human psyche. The other side of it would be not having enough confidence, and that is cowardice. And we have a lot of names for that, right? We don't always say, you're a coward. We say, you're a punk instead. At least, you know, that's what we used to say. What do you guys say if somebody's a coward? What do you call them? You should probably think about how we actually use language. You don't actually say, you're a coward. That person's a coward, do you? What do you say?
Chicken.
Yeah, a chicken. Yeah, you're yellow, you're a chicken. Scaredy cat. All these playground words, right? People still say that? What else do people say? Anything else? Can't say it? Is it like really offensive? Is it a swear word or something? Oh, I know the one you're thinking of. Yeah, okay. All right, say it. Yeah. But this is kind of a good exercise to do. When you're going through Aristotle's virtues, think about how you would describe it to somebody today. I mean, what would you call somebody, we probably don't say rash or foolhardy. What do you call somebody who feels no fear when they ought to feel fear, and they're constantly getting themselves into conflict as a result?
Foolish or stupid.
Yeah? Crazy? Yeah. Or maybe we don't have a word for that. Do we have any other words? Courageous, brave? Maybe our vocabulary is still the same like that.
Bold.
What's that?
Bold.
Bold. Yeah, being bold. Okay. Now, with any of the virtues, it's what you do with that subject matter. So I'll give you another example. What he calls liberality, which literally comes from the Greek word for being a free person. Liberal means free, not being a slave. Forget the traditional political connotation that we have now, where the Democratic Party is the liberal and the Republicans the conservative. Forget all of that stuff for Aristotle. Liberality has to do with wealth, with your money, or your goods. Or I suppose it could be with your time. And what do you do with wealth? You give it, or spend it, and you take it in, right? All of you have a income stream, I hope. Are all of you making money in one way or another? I hope so, because you're spending money, right? And what happens if you keep spending money and you're not taking money in? What's that? You go into debt, or what were you going to say? You're broke, yeah. You can't do things. And liberality is spending the right amount and being fairly free with your money. Not letting your money dominate you. Because we talked about this before. What is money good for? Money is good for other things. If you are actually the kind of person who is willing to spend money for friends, not in a crazy way, but in a well-ordered way, then you're the liberal person. Some people are stingy, aren't they? They want to take, but they don't want to give. Some other people, we're going to talk about this more when we get to book 4, they want to get money from any source whatsoever. So they'll, as we often say, pimp themselves out, right? They'll do just about anything for money. That's a vice. the person who's in the middle, they do what reason would say is the best thing to do. And they follow models of people who have those virtues. If you want to figure out whether your actions are virtuous or vicious, or good or bad, for Aristotle, you have to look at what's comprised in the middle position, and you have to look at other people who act that way. Hopefully you have good models. I hope all of you do. The models that we're presented with are a mixture of good and bad, usually. If you have more bad models than good, it will actually be harder for you to become virtuous, because you'll have to do a bit of unlearning, right? So if everybody that you know spends way too much money and doesn't think about the consequences, and they're always broke at the end of the month, it's going to be harder for you to see this as the way that you really ought to be, as the way that human beings ought to be, because you're used to this. Or if you come from a family where everybody's a tightwad, it's going to be harder for you to be generous with your money, isn't it? Because the models that you have given you expectations. One of the other things that Aristotle points out is that this doesn't always appear to be the best thing to everybody. If you are actually over here, then you are probably going to see that middle position as being way over here. You know, if you are over here, you're going to see that middle position as way over here. So if you're thinking about it in terms of bravery again, if you're actually a coward, then your tendency is probably going to be to look at brave people and to say they're really foolhardy, they're crazy, they're taking these huge risks. If you're a foolhardy person and you're jumping into conflict whenever you can, you know, maybe just for the sake of glory or something, then people who pick their battles, how are you going to look at them? They're a bunch of cowards. They missed a valuable opportunity to send a message, you know, or you know, do something like that. You can think about this in terms of sports teams, right? Is the team that's always on the offense the team that wins? No. This is an analogy. I'm not saying that this actually involves courage, but it's similar. Is the team that's always on the defense, is that the team that wins? You can't win if you're always on the defense, right? You can't score any points. It's got to be a mixture. It's got to be the right amount, at the right time, for the right reasons. There's a lot of rights here that have to be determined. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out to you. Aristotle recognizes that we may not all be virtuous or vicious. As a matter of fact, most of us are somewhere in between. So, this is a way of evaluating people, right? Saying a person is good or bad in this respect. And you could be virtuous in one way and vicious in another way. Like, for instance, I am virtuous with respect to courage, and I have been for a long time. I am vicious, although less vicious than I have been before, with respect to anger. So I'm good in one way and bad in another way. I have work to do. There can be other things where you're not actually virtuous or vicious. Your actions can still be good or bad. So generally, the actions of the virtuous person are going to be good actions. Generally, the actions of the vicious person are going to be bad actions because they're characteristic, right? They flow from that person. Does that mean that the virtuous person never does any bad actions? They may, but it's going to be very rare. What about the vicious person? Do they ever do good actions? Sometimes. Probably for the wrong reasons, but sometimes good. What about the rest of you? Those who are in between. When you're looking at actions, you can determine whether an action itself is, or a pattern, or an emotional response, is virtuous or vicious. The person themselves might not be doing the action because of their character, because they've established this pattern, this habit, this fabric of their character. They may be sort of on the way, one way or the other. Now, if they keep doing actions of that sort, they're going to either go off in this direction and become virtuous, or this direction and become vicious. None of you started out one way or the other. You went one way or the other over time based on what you've done. Where you're going to be 10 years from now is going to be the product of what you choose to do with, whatever it is that you're focusing on for the next 10 years. It's going to be based on where you are right now, but you can change that. Again, if I use myself as an example, I realized that I had a problem with anger when people started telling me in a lot of different ways. Some things like you're a jerk, other things like I don't want to be around you when you get angry. People having different reactions, and I said, well, I got to work on this. And so, what do? How do you actually? First, you have to understand your anger, right? And you've been in anger management, you know that. But then you actually have to get into situations when you get angry, and you have to change your behavior. That's really tough to do. It's one reason why I haven't made as much progress as I should, right? It's very tough to do. But if you want to change your character, that's what it takes. You have to break an old habit and then make a new one. A habit of how you behave, or how you feel, or what your response is. It's the same thing with anything else. If again, if you want your kids to learn how to cook, you actually have to bring them into the kitchen and make them do some of the things. Help you make a sauce first. You don't start out with a really difficult thing. Okay, make me some beef Wellington. Right? You start out with the fairly easy things, baby steps, but you're establishing patterns. You're establishing habits. You got to kick out of that. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that, like, by doing that, you also have to have the virtue of patience.
Ah, yes.
Because.
You mean working with kids?
Yeah. But also adults, it's not only kids.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people that they want to change like right away, and you have to like keep pushing it.
Aristotle doesn't, this is interesting, Aristotle doesn't talk about patience as a virtue. Other people later on will. And what do you think they oppose to patience? If patience is a virtue, there's going to be some vice opposed to it. Can you guess what vice traditionally has been opposed to patience? Anger. Because when we get impatient with people, we tend to get angry with them, don't we? Patience means basically putting up with other people's crap. And you could do it for all sorts of reasons, right? You can put up with people's stuff because you're just kind of the kind of person who walks around like this. That's not actually real patience. To just put up with people's crap because you feel so bad about yourself. Real patience, that would be another vice. Real patience would be putting up with other people's nonsense for a while, to the right extent, because it's needed in those sort of situations. And you're right. Especially when you're dealing with kids, or also adults, it's very easy to become impatient, isn't it? Why can't you learn this? Well, to become virtuous, whether it's moral virtue or intellectual virtue, or even a physical virtue like learning how to swim well, it takes a lot of time and practice. But you become virtuous or you become vicious by doing things over and over again when you're in those situations. That requires choices to be made. That's where we're going to leave off here, because next class session we're going to look at this notion of choice and what's voluntary and what's involuntary. So virtue not only involves a mean, it not only involves what we do with things, how we model things, it involves the choices that we make. So have a good weekend, and see all of you on Monday.